Let us now expound on the economic functions of a colony. As I said, colonies are meant to be basically exploited economically. The Spanish exploited its colonies in the New World by taking its gold and silver and bringing it back to Europe, for example. So we need to talk about also the most controversial exploitation of the New World and that occurred here, and it's going to, of course, be slavery. So the question there is I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and we're going to talk about the story of how slavery comes about. First of all, question, of course, is going to be why Africans? Well, first of all, you have to understand that that Africans are the last peoples to be enslaved. They weren't intended. African slavery was not intended to be in the colonies because they had alternatives. For example, the indigenous populations were intended to be used as a labor force within the colonies long before slaves were going to show up in the New World. But nonetheless, the problem with using an indigenous population is particularly when it comes to Native American population, is twofold. Number one, fewfold, excuse me. Number one, they die from European diseases. They get wiped out by diseases like smallpox and other similar maladies. It's not a very stable workforce. Number two, they're locals. They know where to hide if they ever try to escape. They're not, and the chances of you finding an escaped fugitive Indian slave is going to be very, very slim. It's going to be a very hard prospect to do. And number three, you have gender-specific roles when it comes to your labor. We Westerners, we generally think farming is done by men. But the Indians, we see that it's done by women. So the Indian tribes are resenting the fact that that men are being forced to farm. That's women's work. I mean, why don't you just dress them up in dresses and have them knit at the same time? It's kind of it's similar to that. So Indians the Indian population is not a good population to exploit because they die too quickly. They know when they escape, they know where to hide. And number three, they're not used to the type of labor that the Europeans are demanding of them. So why Africans? Well, first of all, they have been in contact with Europe for centuries, and in fact, they are in. You have to remember that Africa is kind of like if you use your imagination a little bit, it's pretend like Africa is right in the middle between Europe and the Middle East, and this is the battleground, and you see that today. You see that particularly when it comes to the religious battlegrounds, the Christianity, particularly the Catholic Church, is going into Africa and trying to convert Africans, and Muslims today are trying to convert Africans in their sphere of influence. Well, both sides, Christian Europeans and Middle Eastern Muslims, are going to be they're going to enslave Africans to the point that the Arabic word for slave is actually going to be synonymous with black man. So these Africans, they have contact with Europeans, with Middle Easterners, so they are also able to withstand European diseases. They have the antibodies and to be able to withstand the onslaught of European diseases. Another reason why you would choose Africans is going to be because they are not from here. All right, they're taken away from their homeland and they're brought all the way to the New World. Well, they're not from here, and when they escape, they don't know where to hide. They don't know where to go, and the neighboring Indian populations rarely have much sympathy for them. In fact, they're as apt to enslave them as well in some cases. So Africans, they're a better alternative towards slavery because of the fact that they can withstand disease and they are not going to be it's not going to escape as readily and as easily as the Indian population. But of course, before we get to Africans, we have to talk about another group of servants known as indentured servants. We talked about indentured servants briefly in one of the previous slides, so we need to talk a little bit about it more. Let's pretend that you are a poor European, poor Englishman, and you want to come to the New World, but you cannot afford the transit. You can't afford the boat ride over. Well, what you would do is you would find somebody that would sponsor you, that would pay for your visit, for your trip, and you would go and you go on their dime. Well, you're not going there for free, and you're going to have to repay it somehow, and the repayment is going to be the form of service as a laborer to that person. So generally the terms are going to be anywhere between 7 and 10 years. You will work for that person doing whatever they do between 7 and 10 years. Well, there's going to be a problem with indentured servitude in terms of the fact that it's not very practical when it comes to a labor force. Think about it. After you have a servant who's been doing what you've been telling him to do for 7 to 10 years, what do you think they're going to do as soon as they're free? Are they going to go and do something completely new? Or are they going to do something that they are completely used to? I mean, it's not like I'm going to go, if I quit my job, it's not like I'm going to go suddenly become an accountant, for example. So these indentured servants, they get freed and then they do exactly the same thing that they've been doing for the last 7 to 10 years. Problem is, that's called competition. When you free somebody and you allow them to do whatever they want and they generally stay in the same industry, you've created your own competition. So indentured servitude, while it does have similarities towards slavery in terms of the fact you are working for somebody to pay off a debt, or you're working for free, essentially, it's going to be impractical because of the fact that you're going to create your own competition at the same time. Now, slavery existed both in the North and the South. By the Civil War, of course, the North has freed all its slavery. It's abolished slavery. In the South, it has not. But let's talk about Northern and Southern slavery. Picture the North is going to be a very rocky place. We generally think by the time we get to the Civil War, the North is this huge, giant Pittsburgh of industry, and it wasn't. It was overwhelmingly agricultural by the time you get to the Civil War. But nonetheless, we have slavery in the North, but not to the same extent as we do in the South. The northern soils, as you go north, are going to be more rocky, and of course, the weather is not going to be conducive to heavy agriculture. They're not going to be able to satisfy the weather and the soil conditions. They're not going to be able to satisfy the demands for very large agricultural pursuits and plantations. The South, on the other hand, is perfect. In fact, you have this area known as the Black Belt. Basically, we call this the Lower South, from South Carolina all the way to here to Texas. This area is known as the Black Belt, not because there's a whole bunch of slaves here, but because of the color of the soil. It's black. It is the most fertile soil anywhere. So it's going to be conducive to large-scale agriculture. It's easy to dig. You can dig your way all the way, pretty far down. And it's unlike you can do that in the North. And also you have the weather. The weather promotes a growing season of various crops that you can grow at a large-scale capacity, like cotton, for example, and sugar. So this is the difference between Northern and Southern slavery. Northern slavery typically is going to be small scale, whereas Southern slavery is going to be a lot larger scale. Finally, how are slaves acquired and where did they come from? Well, we know they come from Africa, but saying somebody comes from Africa is like saying, oh, I come from Europe. There's a whole bunch of places in Europe, and there's a whole bunch of places in Africa. No one place had a majority of the slaves coming out of its territory. We do have one place that has a polarity. About a quarter of the slaves coming into the New World come from an area known as Angola. They're coming, and about like I said, a quarter of these guys are coming from there. Nowhere else has that many slaves coming through, but all these other places constitute 75% of the slave population coming over. So how do you become a slave? How does a African living a free life in Africa become a slave? Well, let's pretend, shall we, that we are a free African and we're just doing our normal routine, and we hear gunfire or commotion out in the distance, and we see a bunch of angry people coming after you. But the difference is that they're not killing anybody; they're actually capturing people. These are sometimes going to be European traders, or sometimes also fellow Africans from rival tribes, rival peoples, grabbing you and selling. And bringing you to these the slave markets along the coast of Africa. Remember, I told you the Portuguese are going to establish trading posts all around the coast and dominate the slave trade. The result of which is that you're going to have these huge slave trading posts along the coast of Africa. Well, you're taken along the route, and of course these routes are so worn down that it looks like they've been walked on for centuries. And along the way, you're going to see the remains of your fellow enslaved that did not survive the journey. Perhaps they're the lucky ones. I'll talk about that in just a second. So you get there. Let's pretend you get all the way to the slave trading post, where you're basically going to be put up in pens and you're going to be inspected as if a person is trying to buy a pet. And the people that and then let's say then you are sold and you're bought by some representative from a plantation owner in Cuba. Well, then you are placed in a ship. Now these aren't cruise ships. These aren't pleasure ships. These are actual slave ships where they are packing these people like as if they're human sardines. In fact, the image of this presentation, you can see a slave ship and how it was packed to the brim with human cargo. Well, as you're going across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa, we call it the Middle Passage. Of course, you are laying in your own filth. You're barely fed. You're barely watered, and so disease is going to run rampant through these slave ships. And of course, what are they going to do? They're going to take the dead and throw them off the ships. Reports have said that sharks have actually changed their migratory patterns during the Atlantic slave trade because they knew a free meal was going to come off a slave ship. Let's then say you make it all the way to Cuba. Well, then you're sold again. You're sold to the plantation that you're going to work there for the rest of your life. But what if you aren't sold there? What if you're not purchased? What if you are not deemed suitable for the Caribbean? Well, that's when you go into the Americas, the mainland Americas. That's when you start arriving in the American South and in the American North. That's when you start seeing slaves coming into the future United States. So that, in a nutshell, is the process of enslavement, a controversial subject then, and of course a controversial subject now.